Patrick, and thank you all for being here. Before I begin, let me ask how many of you have read Science as a Vocation? All right, I see a few faculty members in the back. How many of you have read anything by Max Weber? A few people, good. For the purposes of this talk, I will assume that you have not encountered Max Weber in any way. We'll start with a blank slate, and I hope by the end of today's talk you will find some interesting things on that blank slate. There's the man in his relatively robust early years, and there in the middle you see the place where he is buried in a cemetery at Heidelberg, which I visited on a sociological pilgrimage a few years ago with my wife and daughter, who were, as you can imagine, very pleased to join me on a muggy summer evening with the mosquitoes swirling around to find in the middle of that cemetery the gravesite of the great man. On the side, you can't quite see it. It says, "Wir finden niemand seinesgleichen," will never find his equal. Undoubtedly a line chosen by his wife, Marianne Weber, also buried later on with him, will never find his equal. That was the impression that Weber gave to many of his contemporaries, and I think it's fair to say that even among sociologists today, Weber is regarded as one of the great figures in the field. But his influence really goes well beyond sociology as a particular field. Even if you have not actually read anything by Max Weber, you may have encountered these terms: the Protestant work ethic, or charismatic leadership, or bureaucracy, or maybe even disenchantment, a term that I'll come back to a little bit later. The point is that Max Weber's terms and ideas have trickled down into the general culture, the general discourse, and you may have met him, encountered him indirectly, even without knowing it. When Patrick and I discussed the topic for this talk, I considered giving a general talk about Max Weber, about his great body of work, which now consists, if I've counted correctly, of 43 volumes and 56 books in the complete edition that a number of German scholars have been working on since the 1970s. Unbelievable output, especially unbelievable when you realize that for much of his career, Max Weber was psychologically incapacitated. He suffered from anxiety, from what we now would consider a form of depression, but he could also work in manic spurts, and that's how you get to 56 books altogether, some of which consist of lectures, some of which consist of letters. The Germans in those days, educated Germans, were great letter writers, and that works to our advantage because we happen to know a lot about him as a result. But I thought 1 minute per book would be a little bit too ambitious for this talk, so instead decided to focus on one particular lecture, a very short piece by Max Weber, about 30, 40 pages or so, that you can read in a couple of hours, relatively readable by Weber's standards. In a way it sums up his great themes. It's also appropriate because, as Patrick said, it's just over 100 years ago that Weber delivered this lecture, which was later published as an essay in November 1917. So this is kind of a delayed centennial celebration of this classic piece. It's a piece that is regularly assigned in sociology classes. I talked to my colleague Judd Owen just before this talk. He uses it regularly in his classes in political science and so on and so forth. This is a staple of the social science literature. When a colleague of mine heard about this lecture last week, I got a message saying, "I love science as a vocation," in the email. I also had a conversation with a graduate student in my office who said in passing, "It is such a tragic piece." So if nothing else today, I want to give you a sense of how a tragic piece, a very sobering piece, is at the same time worth loving. And those two reactions, I think, are very common among readers of Max Weber's Science as a Vocation. That's how I encountered it as an undergraduate when I was about your age, 40 years ago. It was an assigned reading in a sociology class in the Netherlands, and I bought this collection of Max Weber's works, Max Weber's methodological writings, and started reading it. Many Americans would have encountered it in the form that you see on the right-hand side, from a reader put together by Girth and Mills in the 1940s, which really solidified Max Weber's reputation in the United States. Before I get to the actual text, I thought it might be useful to spend a little bit of time on context. So I hope you'll be patient with me. There will be some discussion of the actual content of the lecture. But Max Weber was a very interesting person, and he lived in very interesting times. And I want to say a little bit about that. I also want to make explicit why this is a great lecture. This is a series of lectures about great books, great pieces of music, great paintings. You can find them on the website, but sometimes the presenters don't always say explicitly why they think what they're talking about is actually great. So I want to be a little bit more explicit about that today. And this will be, by the way, the first lecture about a lecture as a great work in its own right. I will say what he actually said. If I have time, I'll comment on English translations. There are 5 complete translations of this one piece. That in and of itself is an indicator, of course, of the status, the classic status it has in the field. I will talk a little bit about what follows from the lecture, and then briefly, if I have time, talk about where I disagree a little bit with Weber. I will do stress number 4. That is, Weber's piece, even though you know nothing about it yet, is significant, especially because it embodies a certain attitude, an attitude towards science and an attitude towards academic teaching. Because what Weber expresses is a deep skepticism about the use of science for political and moral purposes. The abuse of academic teaching to preach particular moral or political standpoints in the classroom. He is very much opposed to that. He's obviously not the only one opposed to that, but he embodies a certain model of intellectual integrity. And so if nothing else, this piece continues to be significant because of the provocative things he has to say about science and about teaching. All right. There he is. You see him on the left-hand side with his wife, Marianne. You see that he changed quite a bit, right, between early and late. This man suffered from very significant mental health challenges, and you can see that in his face. But who he was almost as significant as what he wrote. He was perceived by his contemporaries as a genius and as a prophet. And so people had that feeling about him. We know a lot about him because his wife wrote an enormous biography of him in the 1920s after his death. 500 or 600 pages, one of the most amazing books I read as an undergraduate. It's also a little bit, it reads like a novel, but it's also a little bit misleading because she left out a few things about the complications in their lives that we know about now. And we know about them because they wrote all these letters. There are hundreds of letters by Weber, by people around him that we can use to understand him. And it's fair to say that I know him almost better than I know colleagues that I've been around for years here at Emory because these Germans wrote in great detail about the intimate facets of their own personal life. Here's a biography by Mr. Joachim Radkau, a German historian, subtitle, The Passion of Thought. The Passion of Thought. That is what Weber displays in Science as a Vocation. On the right-hand side, very prominent German journalist, Jürgen Kaube, wrote about Weber as a life between eras. He presents Weber as the representative of a social class, the upper middle class in Germany, very committed to Germany as a rising power, very committed to the values of German culture, but Weber grew up in an atmosphere where Germany was in fact a rising power, but he died at a time when the aspirations of his own social class really had come to naught in 1920 after World War I. In the middle, perhaps the best biography by Dirk Kessler, sociology professor, subtitle, Prussian, Weber as a committed Prussian, Denker, that is thinker, and Muttersohn, mama's boy, that is Weber had a complicated relationship with his parents. His father was a very cynical bureaucrat and politician. His mother was a very pious, religious figure. And some people interpret Weber's whole life course and even the thinking that you see displayed in Science as a Vocation as a kind of balancing act between these two worldviews that he tried to settle in some ways. I'll spare the chronology. He grew up in Berlin, worked in Heidelberg, and died in Munich. A whole bunch of major works, notably some of the most important ones published after his death. So Weber was regarded as a major figure, but also was quite frustrated in not publishing major works during his lifetime. Economy and Society, for example, sometimes regarded as one of the most important books in sociology, only completed and published after he passed away. His questions, very quickly. His professional question had to do with the rise of modern rationalism. a modern rational economy, rational organizations like bureaucracy. How come? How come that in the West, these rational organizations became so significant? His personal question was about finding meaning, a way to develop his personality in difficult circumstances, but he was also a very committed political actor, committed to German power, committed to German culture. He was what is called a national liberal, a liberal nationalist. In November 1917, when he presented this talk, he was looking for a job, ready to resume his academic career after having been incapacitated for many years. He was politically engaged, a strong critic of German war policy, and he was hard at work on sociology of religion, economic sociology, pieces that made him famous long afterwards here in the United States. The date, when did he present this? As you can see, there was a little bit of confusion about that. Many people who presented this piece did not know when he actually presented it. In fact, the editors of the complete edition found out through detective work, looking in newspapers in Munich, that he presented it on November 7th, 1917 at 8 p.m. Important side note, you read those of you who are in the voluntary core classes, you read a lot of famous text. Here's one of the most famous pieces in the social science literature, attended by dozens, if not hundreds, of very well-known people, and even the most basic details have been reported incorrect. I think it reinforces the importance of thinking very critically about even elementary bits of context. Even the place was misstated. He didn't present it at Munich University, he presented it in a lecture hall associated with a bookstore. Important, of course, to know when he did this, because in November 1917, things were not going so well in Germany. Within Germany, there was a great polarization between various groups. Some people wanted to quit the war, some people wanted to fight to the bitter end. Nationalists versus socialists. Current polarization in the United States is nothing like that. American entry into the war, of course, had made victory unlikely, even though many Germans still were hoping for a breakthrough. And interestingly, on the Eastern Front, of course, the Russian Empire had collapsed, and on the very day that Max Weber presented this talk, the Bolsheviks took final power in Russia. Weber was invited to give career advice to a group of independent students, advanced students, and recent graduates thinking about possibly pursuing an academic career. And they were interested in becoming well-rounded intellectuals. What Weber does in his talk is to pour cold water on his student expectations. So the talk was given to people like yourself, maybe a little bit older, and trying to explain why it might make sense or why it might not make sense to pursue an academic career. But as you'll see in a minute, Weber went far beyond that particular topic. The subtext of his talk is a kind of attack, a kind of polemic against an attitude that he attributed to young people. Obviously, these were very difficult times for German youth. Terrible war, no prospects after the war. People were trying to find a way out, and many people were interested in connecting with nature. Some people were trying to find an escape in mystical experience. Some people were doing drugs. Some people were attracted to the emerging National Socialist movement, and so on and so forth. This kind of escape into irrational personal experience is what Weber attacks throughout this piece. And he, in a sense, displays his own rationalism as a kind of alternative attitude. Here's how it first appeared in the published version in 1919, and it has been reprinted frequently since that time. Why was it a great lecture? Here's a response by a contemporary, somebody who attended this talk, Karl Löwit, who became a well-known philosopher in his own right. He said, the impact of the lecture was stunning. The experience and knowledge of a lifetime were condensed into these sentences. Everything came directly from within. He tore down all the veils from desirable objects, yet everyone nonetheless sensed that the heart of this clear-thinking intellect was profoundly humane. Right? And that is a kind of impact, a kind of impression that many people have had reading Science as a Vocation later on. Not everybody, however, was quite so enthusiastic. Here's a comment by one of the co-organizers of the talk. He said, disturbing is the position, especially of the leading figures among the professors. To them, science increasingly becomes a form of decent suicide, a way to die in stoic heroism. In other words, many organizers were looking for some guidance, some direction, and Weber wouldn't give it to them, and many of them were a little bit disenchanted with him as a result. He also was being attacked from the political left and the right. He was a little bit in political limbo as well. Why was it a great lecture? It was a great rhetorical performance. As you'll see in a minute, Weber pleads for a certain kind of intellectual honesty, for a certain kind of tough-mindedness. Yet he does so in a very passionate way. And so there's a great tension between what he says and how he says it. It reads as an autobiographical confession, not quite on the scale of St. Augustine, but it's similar, somebody who is reflecting on the ideas and experiences of a lifetime. It's great as a historical document because it comes right at the end of World War I, towards the end of World War I, when educated Germans began to think maybe our commitments to German greatness were misguided and mistaken. And there's a kind of tragic sense of loss that underlies this essay. And then finally, it's great in its provocative arguments, particularly about the limits of science, the limits of academic teaching, and the necessity to be totally honest about those limits. So I think, put together, I think it makes for a very powerful piece. What did he say? I will give you a slightly more sophisticated rendering in just a second, but this is the Cliff Notes version. So you want to become anybody want to go to graduate school, perhaps, in the future? Yeah? Well, I mean, don't let me discourage you with what, I'm just reporting what Weber said, okay? So you want to become, it's a tough gig and gamble. Okay, so that's what he starts with. You think scholarship can have lasting value? Forget it. You think science can show the meaning of life? Not anymore. You think teachers should tell you what to do or how to think political? That's just wrong. You think science can be a vocation? And then he sort of kind of gives an answer to that, and we'll see how he actually formulates it. Already you can tell from this rudimentary summary that Weber's whole speech came across to his audience as a bit of a cold shower. All right, step number one. He starts with, again, going against the expectations of his audience, he starts with what he calls external circumstances, describing the, quote-unquote, Americanization of German higher education. Germany had been in the vanguard of modern science, but by 1917, the United States was taking over. And of course, for many Europeans, Americanization is just about the worst thing that can happen. In fact, Weber was not as anti-American as many of his fellow Germans, but nonetheless, he invokes America as a specter of a kind of stifling bureaucratic structure that is emergent. He also points out that the career path of academics, especially in Germany, was very tough, and that combining research and teaching skills, which people are supposed to do here at Emory University, for example, combining those is difficult, and not everybody has that. Not everybody can do that. Here's a quote from Weber about these external circumstances. He says, we see the situation that exists wherever capitalist operations are to be found in these new scientific institutes, the separation of the worker from the means of production, a Marxist phrase. Our German university life is becoming Americanized, as is German life in general. The spirit that prevails in these universities is different from the traditional climate of German universities, which were committed to a certain high culture. All right, so he starts out throwing this at students, pretty depressing. 15, 20 minutes into the talk, people say, whoa, this is not exactly what I expected. Gets worse. Second, he says, well, you came to my talk, this career advice, right, to hear about the inner vocation, the inner meaning of an academic career. But he says, in science, real achievement requires passion for specialization. It's not about broadening your horizons. It's not about developing, cultivating your mind. It's about becoming a specialist. You have to put on blinders. Except sociologists, because sociologists were allowed to poach on neighboring fields, which is what Weber himself did. Okay, so the irony here is that Weber is preaching the importance, the necessity of specialization, even though he himself was hardly a specialist. Okay? Another tension in what he is saying. He says real personality requires dedication to the subject, but in science, progress undercuts meaning. Because in science, you want your work to be superseded. Right? You want somebody else to come along and do a better job. So then the question arises, okay, well, what is the point of doing work that somebody else 10 or 20 years later is going to do better? That raises a fundamental question. Where's the meaning in that? That raises a fundamental question. In parentheses, another irony, of course, is that Weber himself, in a sense, disproved his point, because his work certainly, we're still reading it, we're still talking about it, right? Shows that perhaps work can have lasting value, and perhaps in the social sciences, progress doesn't undermine the value of older work quite as much. Here's a quote. Nowadays, he says, a really definitive and valuable achievement is always the product of specialization. At the same time, nothing has any value for a human being as a human being unless he can pursue it with passion. And so that is, in a sense, the struggle, right? How can you be passionate about something that requires you to limit your humanity, to put on these blinders, to want your work to be superseded? That is a hard dilemma. Weber is, in a sense, laying out that dilemma for his audience. So the second step, more cold shower effect, right? Half an hour, 45 minutes into this talk, people say, oh my God, this is a pretty sobering presentation. Step number 3, Weber switches into a completely different gear, talking about what he calls the vocation of science in modern culture. What does science do for us, generally, for society? He says science is part of what he calls disenchantment, the increasing idea that we can calculate how nature and how society works, that we don't need to appeal to higher powers, to religious or magical forces. That is disenchantment, Entzauberung in German. He says science has become a purely secular enterprise. People used to think it was a path to truth, a path to goodness, a display of God's creation. Protestant scientists, Isaac Newton and others, really thought that they were discovering the structure of God's creation. Weber says by the early 20th century, maybe a few people but still believe that, but by and large, science has lost its roots in moral philosophy, has lost its roots in religion as well. It's naive. It's naive to think about science as a path to happiness. He also says that science cannot help us figure out what our values are. There's a gap between values and scientific analysis. Our values are at war with each other. The French have their values, the Germans have their values, and there's no scientific way to decide whose values are best. Science can give us technical knowledge and methods of thinking. The only really humanly significant thing about science from Weber's point of view is that it can force us to clarify what our values actually are and what it means to act on the values that we actually choose. And so we can do a kind of scientific analysis of our own choices. And Weber says that gaining clarity about that is significant. Right? So that is as far as he wants to go. Technical knowledge, methods of thinking, he sort of poo-poos that a little bit. He had no taste for engineering. Here are some quotes to reinforce those points. He says scientific progress is a fraction, indeed the most important fraction, of the process of intellectualization to which we have been subjected. The idea that human minds can figure out how the world works without any assistance from God, without any assistance from higher powers. Science today, he says, is a profession practiced in specialist disciplines. It is not a gift of grace on the part of seers and prophets dispensing sacred goods and revelations. Implicitly, he is talking to his colleagues, many of whom did want to dispense sacred goods, arguing that their historical analysis proved the superiority of the German nation, for example, or that their historical analysis of warfare proved the need for pacifism and the like. Those kinds of revelations Weber was very much opposed to. He then segues once again to talk about the responsibility of teachers. Again, not something necessarily that his audience was thinking about when they entered this lecture room. He says German students at the time are looking up to their professors for guidance, for moral guidance, political guidance. But he says that is naive and wrong because it inhibits the search for truth, number one, and teachers aren't cut out to be leaders. I've had Emory basketball players, men's basketball players in my classes, And they had a good time in my classes, but I think it's fair to say that they look up to Coach Z, Jason Zimmerman, much more than to me. He is a moral leader for them in a way that I, as a teacher, cannot be. And Weber says, that's all right. That is the way it should be, in a way. It is a mistake for students to look up to their teachers for guidance beyond their academic scientific analysis. And he says then for teachers should not assume false authority as if they know how their students should live, as if they know what society should do. Teachers should, in fact, do the opposite. Teachers should supply what he calls inconvenient facts that challenge partisan opinion, but force students to think harder so that people can be more accountable for their own actions. Here's a quote. I won't read the whole thing, but he says, politics has no place in the lecture room. And the German lecture room was a little bit more authoritarian than it is today. Students couldn't really talk back to their teachers. All the more reason, he said, not to impose a teacher's politics on students. There is, the integrity of teachers requires that we distinguish between establishing facts and answering the question of the value of culture. Those are two very different things. The prophet and the demagogue have no place at the lecture. And that is his recurrent refrain. And then towards the end of the lecture, he shifts into yet another gear, kind of reaches a kind of crescendo. He says, well, you may have been thinking about the status of theology. Well, nobody in his audience would have been thinking about the status of theology, but it gives him a way to shift into a discussion of religious issues. Something that nobody on that occasion had come in thinking about at the beginning of the talk. But obviously, Weber himself is passionately involved in figuring out how to find meaning, not just in the lives of his audience, but how to find meaning in his own life. And so the last pages, you see that he's sort of getting entranced by his own ideas. He says, for example, that there is an unbridgeable gap between the value of science and the value of religious salvation. An allusion to his mother's background. As I mentioned, she was very religious. Weber could not find comfort in the religious faith that was so significant for his mother. He had chosen the path of science, but he always felt the pull of a kind of religious vocation as well. And that is what gives this lecture a certain pathos. He says other people can make what he called the sacrifice of the intellect, to let go of science and analysis and simply rejoin traditional churches. But he says most people in Germany at the time were looking for a kind of pseudo-religion. They were getting interested in psychoanalysis, for example. As I mentioned, Munich, where he was speaking, was also a hotbed of radical nationalist activity, later leading to the formation of the National Socialist Party, right there. All these he regarded as pseudo-religions. There was no real prophecy behind it, no real theology, no real God. It was fake and phony. And so he attacks those phony attempts to find meaning in inauthentic ideologies. In the final analysis, he says, in a disenchanted world, ultimate values, love, goodness, have faded from public life. Public life there's a naked public sphere, as an American author once called it. A naked public sphere in which ultimate values, religious values, don't matter anymore. And people understandably retreat into interpersonal relations to find some remnant of meaning. Still, in the end, he says, we must meet the demands of the day, an allusion to a famous phrase by the German author Goethe. Let me give you two more quotes and I'll stop in terms of analyzing the actual content. He says, in typical Weberian manner, right, his prophetic voice, our age is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all by the disenchantment of the world, the Entzauberung. Its resulting fate is that precisely the ultimate and most sublime values have withdrawn from public life, and so on and so forth. Longing and waiting for a kind of religious figure to help us out is not enough. We must go about our work and meet the challenges of the day, but in our human relations and our vocation. But that moral is simple and straightforward. If each person finds in the base the daemon, the inner force that holds the threads of his life. Again, an allusion to Goethe, who was a great model for German intellectuals. Okay? Face the demands of the day. That is sort of what he left his audience with. So by the end of his talk, you can imagine that actual listeners were reeling a little bit, that they got a very different presentation than what they had bargained for, so to speak, and were left a little bit questioning a little bit. What is the way forward? For people like Carl Leeuwit, it was very exciting, but other students said, I want some answers. I don't want just this skeptical attitude. What follows from that? One of the key things that follows from his talk for us is what I mentioned before. Weber embodies this kind of skeptical attitude about science and about teaching. When you hear today university administrators, even more than faculty, talk about the university can do X, Y, and Z for the world, or a certain dean who won't be with us very much longer, talking about how Emory is committed to the pursuit of social justice. That is just the kind of thing that would have riled up Max Weber, because he said that is taking a step that is both logically and intellectually questionable. So, for example, if somebody were to make a statement that sociological studies show, as they do, continuing inequality between class, racial, and ethnic groups, an academic institution that produces this knowledge must devote itself to the pursuit of social justice. Right? So a Weberian approach to these sorts of issues would say, you can choose social justice as a political goal, but you can't commit an academic institution to it. Science doesn't tell you whether social justice is the right thing to do. And once you commit yourself or an institution to that political goal, you start looking for support for that goal. It inhibits further critical analysis. Okay? So Weber would be very skeptical about that. He would also be skeptical about something that may seem even more straightforward. Since climate studies demonstrate the reality and impact of anthropogenic global warming, we must limit that impact and promote sustainability. Now, he's not saying that you can't commit yourself to sustainability. That is a legitimate choice. He is saying that that commitment doesn't follow from the analysis, and that you have to be very careful about making that commitment because the temptation is very great. Once you make that commitment, to look for evidence that supports your position as opposed to doing continual critical analysis. Okay, so Weber's skeptical attitude, I think, is still very significant and very provocative, as you can see, I think, in these examples. Very briefly, I'll mention that I've told you what Weber said, as if it was clear what he said. It's clear to me, but in fact, it's somewhat tricky to find out what he actually said. If you read it very closely, say, what does he mean? Even Germans have difficulty with that. A few years ago, I had a German-speaking student. The family came to the United States from Germany, and I gave her this piece to read for extra credit. And she took it home. This was before the days of, I think it was an actual hard copy that she took home. She showed it to her parents, and she reported back the following week that her parents, who are German, found it too difficult to read. So there you go. And Science as a Vocation is more readable than many other works by Weber, for what it's worth. 5 translators, very serious people, have tried their hand at translating this piece. And I just want to show you very quickly how tricky that is, how tricky it is to translate. This, of course, is a commonplace in the humanities, but for us in the social sciences, sociology in particular, we tend to ignore these issues. We just take a text at face value and try to use the ideas, not really thinking about, okay, well, what's really going on in the text, in the language itself. Okay, so I just want to quickly alert you to the fact that the language itself is difficult. Translation is tricky. A lesson, I think, that applies to many voluntary core courses that many of you are participating in. Here's one example. So Weber makes this point that students should not look up to their professors as leaders. They should be more like American students, because American students simply pay their tuition, want to get their service, just like vegetables at the grocery store. And American students, he said at the time, he was exaggerating, of course, American students would never think of treating their professors as prophets or political leaders. Except wenn der Lehrer etwa ein Footballmeister ist, Weber uses the term football, dann ist auf diesem Gebiet sein Führer. That's not a very hard German statement, but look. Gertha Mill said, if the teacher happens to be a football coach, then in this field he is a leader. That was my reference to Coach Zimmerman. That's a very sensible translation. That's what Weber meant. In American colleges, coaches have more authority. Players, athletes look up to their coaches more than to regular teachers, and Weber says that's fine. Gordon Wells, if a teacher is, for example, a champion footballer, then in this area he is a leader. Whoa. Champion. Meister these days means champion. When Germany, I don't say if, I say when Germany wins the upcoming World Cup, there will be Weltmeister. Weltmeister. So champion, yes, but that's not what Weber meant. If a teacher is, say, a football champion, then he is the student's leader in that field. Again, how that works, not clear. And then the worst, Rodney Livingston, professional translator, very serious person, a very readable translation otherwise. He says, if the teacher happens to be a soccer star, then he will be regarded as a leader on the soccer field. Now you tell me, were there many soccer stars in American colleges in 1917? I don't think so. So he was overcorrecting for a European use of football, interpreting as meaning soccer, and then it sort of completely went astray. Right? So this is a trivial example, but it tells you, if you're just reading one translation, it can steer you off course. One more example that's a little bit more serious, very briefly. Weber talks about how people in the West were losing a sense of religious and moral coherence. They were trying to find salvation in these false gods. He says, heute aber ist es religiöser Alltag, by contrast with the days of old. Now these are 6 very common German terms. But look here. You see that you get 5, well, 2 are sort of similar, but 5 quite different translations, right? You read one translation, you really have no idea what's going on, right? Good critical side note to keep in mind as many of you read translated text in your voluntary core courses. What's really going on? These are just 2 examples, and there are dozens more. I wrote a whole paper about it. I can give it to you. And of course, many social scientists don't make these comparisons. We don't have time. It's too hard, and so on and so forth. You don't have time as undergraduates to compare 5 or 6 translations of the same piece. But in some ways you should, right? So figuring out what he said is actually a little bit more difficult than I made it seem a few minutes ago. Was he right? I still like his debunking attitude towards the false gods of academia, his narrow views of science, his model of intense engagement with the realities and events of the day. His personality, I think, is attractive in that sense. And his broader sociological vision that is significant to me and significant to many people in the field. I can come back to this, if you like, in the Q&A. But I also disagree. I realize there's quite a bit of text here. Let me just emphasize a few points. Weber talks about the impact of this endless progress on science. That is, if science keeps moving on, what is the significance of any particular contribution, the role that any particular person plays? But he himself had argued that in social science at least, we don't pick our projects, our problems, based on some abstract theory. We do it based on the things that concern us as human beings, the things that we find valuable. Well, if that's the case, then something that Weber did in 100 years ago can remain valuable to me if my values make his work and his questions significant to me today. And of course, Weber's own work didn't really fit the mold. His work has had lasting value. So again, his own work, in a sense, refutes one of the key points that he makes. He proposes a very restrictive view of vocation. But he also says that values have become entirely subjective. Everybody picks their own. Well, if that's the case, then everybody can give their own meaning to whatever work they're doing. I'll give you an example. Many of my colleagues in sociology and also in the School of Public Health are committed to improving the health of people around the world. Now, Weber would say, well, that's the use of science in a very instrumental way. That may be true, but for many of those colleagues, improving the health of humanity is an intrinsically significant thing, right? And therefore, they would say, well, yes, my findings about how to improve health, say Reynaldo Martorell in the School of Public Health, my findings about how to improve nutrition for people in Central America, they may be superseded. We may have better programs to deal with that in 10 or 20 years, but that doesn't make my current work meaningless at all. It is a very significant step towards a very worthy goal, right? So Weber's position, I think, is a little bit too restricted. And finally, Weber pleads for clarity and honesty, but he may fall short himself. He advocates coming to terms with rationalization, right? An economy that consists of big business, education system that has big bureaucracies, a political system that has big bureaucracies. We have to deal with it. We can't be engaged in wishful thinking. That's his basic position. We should not seek fulfillment in irrational sensual experience. But, as I'll show in a second, he himself, I think, was tempted by other gods and other goddesses, ones that he appeared to spurn as he was criticizing the students. In other words, I'm not calling him a hypocrite exactly, but there was more going on in his own life and his own thinking than he explicitly acknowledged in the way he spoke to the students. Because he was also a man in love with a woman who was not his wife, Else Jaffe van Richthofen. She had been a family friend. She had been Weber's first female PhD student. In fact, she was one of the first female students at the University of Heidelberg. She was the wife of his friend, Edgar Jaffe. She had been the partner of Max's brother, Alfred. Yes, these people had complicated personal relations. Weber had been infatuated with her for many years, but he had kept his distance once she took up with his brother Alfred. But in 1916, they reconnected. She came to one of his lectures and was blown away by that lecture. And that lit a spark, and that led them to rekindle the relationship. She met him at another lecture about Judaism, that continued the relationship. And on the way to when Weber was on the way to giving this talk, Science as a Vocation, he met with her the previous week. And they had, as what one biographer describes as, a decisive encounter. Not exactly sexual yet. That came probably the following year. But nonetheless, they had a meeting of minds and hearts. And that, I think, gives a different cast to this lecture that people in the literature have not commented on, because he really had adopted a new frame of mind. He had begun what he himself called in one of his letters a second youth. He was not just speaking to the students. I believe that he was giving this lecture as if he was speaking to her, saying, "This is who I am." That is what he was doing. And of course, that also complicates what he was saying a little bit, because he was making this tremendous plea for a very ascetic, a very rational, a very stern approach to the issues of the day. But in fact, he was seeking meaning, true fulfillment, true meaning, in his budding relationship with Elsa. That is, he was doing what he accused the students of doing. Again, I'm not calling him a hypocrite. I'm simply pointing that out, first of all, to clarify that between the lines of this text, as is always the case in classic texts, there's more going on than we realize, and that the problem of finding meaning in modern life, which is what Weber worked up to in this tremendous crescendo at the end of Science as a Vocation, the problem of finding meaning in modern life is even more complicated than he explicitly acknowledged, than he explicitly described in Science as a Vocation. Thank you very much.
We'd like to take your questions.
Yes.
Given that, as a whole, Western civilization has kind of rejected his offer to, or not so much his advice, and religion has kind of been superseded by science. The new priests of today are the scientists.
Yeah.
If you could see society today, do you think you would feel vindicated, given that how popular they are on YouTube and the Tide Pods?
Yeah, well, I think I'm not sure that Western civilization has rejected his advice entirely. But I take your point that there certainly are many people who haven't been listening carefully to Weber, let's put it that way, right? And that there is still this strong temptation of treating scientists as the authority, not just on their specialized area, but as the authority on saving the planet, saving the United States, whatever, right? So I take your point on that score. I think he would feel vindicated in the sense that the impact of science on actual policy, the impact of science or academic teaching on the actual thinking of students, for example, the impact is not as great as may appear from the discourse about science. People have done studies of what do students actually take away from the teaching of their professors, and I think there's limited evidence that the politics of their professors has a significant impact on what students come away with after college, for example. Right? So I think he would feel partly vindicated in the sense that the way in which these various institutions have developed continue on the path of rationalization, have dispensed with various religious justification. If you think about Emory University, for example, starting as a Methodist institution, there still is some of that Methodist spirit there, but correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think in day-to-day life you feel that is the Methodist tradition informs what we do here. And that would be an example of the continual rationalization. That is, rationalization is also a form of secularization. And I think that to some extent limits the impact of science as well. Weber, like many good German intellectuals, certainly in his day, was sort of ambivalent about many of these things. Right? That is, the most sophisticated German intellectuals were cautious about saying A or B. I think he would make a kind of balanced assessment of what's going on today. Many sociologists, many of my colleagues in the field, treat his analysis of rationalization as a very powerful framework for thinking about what's happening today. Right? So one of the reasons why Weber is a classic in sociology is that we can read his other work, his harder to read work, and say, wait a minute, what he was saying about bureaucracy, what he was saying about capitalism, and so on and so forth, we can still see that today, 100 years later. So in that sense, he would feel vindicated. So, may I give other people a chance? But I'll come back to you in a bit. I saw another.
What was his opinion on the German monarchy?
I hesitate because, again, for Weber and certainly the people around him, the monarchy and the emperor represented German strength. But at the same time, he was extremely critical of the emperor. He was extremely critical of the authoritarian clique around the emperor. He was extremely critical about the irrational war policy that they were pursuing. And even though he was not exactly a Democrat by our current standards, in the context of his time, he was arguing for a more democratic system. So, for example, at the end of World War I, he advocated a direct election of a president. That is, after they had gotten rid of the emperor, of the monarchy. Okay, so his personal preference was for a more republican system with direct elections and for more influence of parliament as well. Okay, so earlier in his life, he was a really diehard nationalist, and many of the diehard nationalists really perceived a strong authoritarian leader as necessary for Germany to become a great power. But Weber himself became, shall I say, disenchanted with that position. And one of the reasons why students invited him was that he was perceived as one of the leading critics of the political establishment in his time. Okay, so students who were looking for a way out perceived Max Weber, ironically, as a kind of prophet. And then, of course, in his actual talk, he declined to take on that role. Yes?
Do you think that his views on what a meaningful life and a meaningful career is were like alive today in today's society?
Are you asking me what his views would be today? Whether do you think, in other words, you're asking whether you think he would stick to his guns, so to speak?
Yes.
Hard to say. One reason I think he would have changed is that if you look at his whole life course, he changed his mind even in his lifetime. Okay, so chances are that he would have changed his mind later on. Second reason to think that he would have changed is what happened in the last few years of his life. Right? I deliberately finished with his love story because that, in his letters, you can see what you cannot see in Science as a Vocation. Somebody who has to rethink what his life was about. He had dedicated himself to science and scholarship. He had dedicated himself to a very ascetic, rational approach to political and social issues. But here he finds himself surrendering to this woman, right? So at the end of his life, he is already changing. And I think that would have continued a lot as well. The third reason why I think he would have changed is, of course, that Germany went through tremendous turmoil. I mean, if he was critical of what was happening before the rise of National Socialism, you can only imagine how scathing he would have been about the pseudo-religion being peddled by the National Socialists. Right? So in some ways, both personally and politically, I hate to say it this way, it's good that he died in 1920 because his own life might have unraveled. It would have been very difficult. He had a very tolerant wife, but if he had known the full details of his relationship with Elsa, that would have been difficult. She and Elsa, by the way, remained friends for the rest of their lives. That's another interesting point. And politically, he died at the right moment because in the 1920s, of course, Germany took exactly the wrong direction from Weber's point of view. Yes?
Considering Germany took the blame for World War I and then Greece for World War II, do you think the outcome of the world wars sort of lessen the significance of these German intellectuals in general, especially Max Weber?
Yes and no. Initially, yes, but later on, no. And I don't say that because I'm an academic and I like to hedge my bets here. Initially, yes, because Germany had been on the cutting edge of science, including social science. It used to be that graduate students from the United States would go for a couple of years to Germany, right? Many leading figures in my field. W.E.B. Du Bois, go to Germany, spend time in the same seminar that Weber had attended and so on and so forth. Weber and Du Bois knew each other. Okay, so Germany had been on the cutting edge. By the 1920s, that was less the case. So at least for a while, there was less interest. But Weber in particular regained his reputation or gained a greater reputation later on than even during his lifetime. And there's several reasons for that. I won't go into all of them. One reason is that after World War II, when Marxism became more fashionable in intellectual circles, first in Europe and then in the United States, many non-Marxist intellectuals were looking for an alternative way of thinking. And they seized upon Weber's work as a kind of smart bourgeois way of thinking about economic and social issues that was not burdened with the faults of Marxism. Okay, so that's one reason why Weber became a big deal. And then, of course, there were translations of Weber's work. As problematic as these translations are, when English-speaking audiences began to get access to Weber's work, starting with his famous book on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, he said, "Whoa, there's a great mind at work here. We have to take this seriously." Okay, so there's the actual pattern of the influence of people like Weber is quite complicated. But I'd say if you just as a quantitative measure, if I may be a crude sociologist for a moment, as a quantitative measure of his influence, one of my colleagues, Alan Sika, more than 10 years ago, added up all the publications about Max Weber that he could find, and he got to 4,000. So certainly there have been a lot more in the last decade. So I think it's fair to say that there are about 5,000 commentaries, analyses, studies dealing with Max Weber, including these massive biographies. So certainly today there's a whole Weber industry. In fact, there's a whole journal devoted to Max Weber. There you go. Yes?
As someone interested in social science broadly, but particularly read sociology, what works of Weber's or the sociological canon in general would you recommend?
Well, let me say what I don't recommend. I don't recommend that you do what I did as an undergraduate. I was very interested in becoming a sociologist and said, well, in the summertime, summer break, this was in the olden days when things were not available online, right? I will borrow some books from the university library, I will take them home, and I will just read them, right? So I took home, again, I'm recommending that you not do that, took home Economy and Society, which is this big book that published in 2 volumes in English. So I open it up, and start reading on page 1. That's how you read a book, right? Yes? Yeah, start on page 1, and then I turn the page and kept reading. Oh my God. After an hour, I said, wait, I got maybe to page 5 by the end of 1 hour. I said, what's going on here, right? Then there was a whole bunch of typologies. Then there was a whole deep discussion of historical issues that I had no knowledge of. Then there was an excursion into medieval trading companies. It blows your mind, right? Don't do that. So it's actually a slightly difficult question to answer. There are some other essays by Weber where he lays out the program of his studies in the late 1910s, and I can talk to you after this presentation and give you some suggestion, and I'm happy to do that with others as well. There are bits and pieces of Economy and Society that are very readable. There are parts of his work on China and India that are very interesting. And perhaps the most obvious recommendation is to read his work on the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Again, the translation issues that I mentioned a minute ago for Science as a Vocation also affect the readability of the Protestant ethic. But the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, short book, first published as a series of articles, has perhaps provoked more commentaries than any other work in 20th century social science, and the debate about it continues. So that is a fairly readable book, and certainly will make you think about Weber's issues.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Lechner.
Thank you very much.